While this video is going to be concerned with the second harder module of the Bluebook test number 10, I wanted to start on the introductory screen here so you can see how we end up with the time and a half pacing that we're going to use for this exam walkthrough, just so that I've got a little bit more time to instruct as opposed to just racing through every problem. So you can see how you're going to want to maintain a consistent process for all of the different question types. So from this introductory screen, you're going to select full-length practice, you're going to select the test type, you're going to select SAT. And for this video, we're going to practice test 10, and you can select this little toggle switch that will allow you to choose your extended time. So for this video, we're going to do time and a half because we shouldn't need double time or anything beyond that, just to walk through everything and explain what I'm doing so you can do it yourself on a practice exam. And we may end up with extra breaks or that sort of thing as well, but this is how we get the time and a half that we're going to use in this harder second modules. Now, I'm not going to be able to skip through and go straight to the next module, so we're going to just kind of jump ahead in the video. As soon as you hit next from the final question, you're going to see this review screen and you'll be able to return back to any questions that you might have flagged for review. But we're going to just hit next and you will immediately be ported over to the next module 2 of the reading and writing section, as you can see up here. And this module is what is known as adaptive. So it's going to have its difficulty of the questions dictated by your performance on the first section. And this here is going to be the hardest of the modules that you can get in the adaptive Bluebook exam number 10. Now, once we're here, we're going to have to engage with the interface to force really engagement and efficiency as we're working through these problems. So the first questions of any reading and writing module are always going to be these vocabulary in context style questions. So we need to select the highlight tool up top, and we're going to click on this little ABC with a slash through so that we can do some process of elimination. And we want to read the information on the left without engaging the question answer choices, because those are there to trick us. We don't want to just plug those in haphazardly. But we're going to read this little paragraph on the left and we're going to highlight the information that directly influences what should go into this blank, and we're going to mentally predict what would fit in there and then compare the answer choices against that mental prediction as opposed to just going ahead and kind of plug and playing. So we read on the left, critics have asserted that fine art and fashion rarely blank in a world where artists create timeless works for exhibition and designers periodically produce new styles for the public to buy. Luiseno Shoshone Bannock beadwork artist and designer Jamie Okuma challenges this view. Her work can be seen in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and purchased through her online boutique. So we could just highlight that this lady challenges this view. We can make sure that it's a nice little yellow. And if we want to actually write down our own prediction of what would fit in the blank, you can click on the notes here and just have that. So we know that Jamie Okuma challenges whatever the view is in the blank by doing both these things, by creating timeless works for exhibition and producing new styles for the public to buy. So we could just kind of say something like happen simultaneously as our prediction here. And now we're going to go to our answer choices and cross-check them against this prediction, not just plug and playing. So prevail certainly does not match happen simultaneously. Neither does succumb. Neither does diverge. Intersect certainly does, and you'll want to read this choice back into the sentences to make sure that you've got an overall coherent narrative. So we read, critics have asserted that fine art and fashion rarely intersect in a world where artists create timeless works for exhibition and designers periodically produce new styles for the public to buy. Luiseno Shoshone Bannock beadwork artist and designer Jamie Okuma challenges this view. Her work can be seen in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and purchased through her online boutique, and that should be a narrative that flows. So we can move on to the next question, which is another vocabulary in context format. So don't really need to highlight anything in the task. It's pretty clear. And we're going to, again, ignore the answer choices and just consider the sentence, highlighting whatever is going to directly influence that blank. Here we read, barring major archaeological discoveries, we are unlikely to ever have blank account of ancient Egypt under the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. As much of the evidence of her reign was deliberately destroyed by her successors. So we know that the evidence of this female pharaoh's reign was destroyed. So we can just bring up the notes again and just say, ever have a good account. It doesn't have to be all that creative. I just need to have something that would fit in the blank based on the surrounding context. And we know that the evidence was destroyed, so we're not going to have a good account of the ancient Egypt under this female pharaoh. So we then cross-check the answer choices against a good account. So an imaginative, that doesn't match a good account. Superficial is a tone reversal. Exhaustive would be a good account in context. And questionable would not match good. We would read exhaustive back into the sentence to confirm that it creates an overall coherent narrative. But we'll move on to the next question for the purposes of this video. Now we will read the next excerpt as well, doing the same thing. The work of Kiowa painter T.C. Cannon derives its power in part from the tension among his blank influences: classic European portraiture with its realistic treatment of faces, the American pop art movement with its vivid colors, and flat style, the intertribal painting style that rejects the effect of depth typically achieved through shading and perspective. So we know this is all about this painter's influences, and we know his many different influences. We've got European portraiture, which we could highlight, the American pop art movement, which we could highlight, and intertribal painting. If you like using the little notes, you can use it. If you feel that the highlights are enough, that's fine too, understanding that this is a timed exam. So we then contrast the answer choices against that prediction of many different. Complementary is not highlighting the differences, so we can eliminate choice A. Unknown is not highlighting the differences. In fact, they are clearly known. They are articulated in the sentence. Then we've got disparate, which matches different, and then interchangeable, which would not match many different, highlighting those differences. If there are any words you do not know the definition of, add them to a vocabulary list for your continued review as part of your study for the SAT. And of course, on the actual exam, you'd reread disparate into that blank to confirm that you create an overall coherent narrative. But we'll move on to the next of these vocab and context questions for the purposes of the video. So number 4, same general idea. We've got the highlight tool, and we read from the beginning. Proposals to raise the age at which retirees begin receiving government transfers of funds are generally discussed in terms of the effects on transfer recipients, but Andrea Smith has argued that delaying such transfers could blank wealth creation among working adults by lengthening the period in which they are providing financial support to their non-working parents. So I probably just highlight lengthening, and I know that whatever our correct answer is has to match lengthening. Now, let's just pretend I don't know what stymie means. I've got to hold it open. I can't eliminate it. Compound, well, if we compound wealth creation, we're not lengthening the wealth creation. That's actually going to increase the wealth creation, so that would be a tone reversal. Disparage is going to mean insulting. Again, if you don't know what it means, you'll have to hold it open. And outstrip actually means it's going to go faster. So that is also going to be an incorrect answer choice. If you don't know at least 50% of the answer choices, this is the kind of question that you might mark for review and come back to at the end of the section here. But stymie would match lengthening or stopping wealth creation in context. Again, of course, reread your choice if you know what the word stymie means to confirm that you've got an overall coherent narrative at this point. Now, when we move to the next question here, you can see we're in our reading comprehension, like understanding the big picture of little passages portion of this section. If you have trouble finishing the reading and writing modules, what you can do is actually jump to the end of the section and address the writing half of the test from this point on. And what this is going to do is allow you to get through the things that tend to take less time within a reading and writing module, and then spend more time and not feel rushed as you're going through those longer paragraph passages in the middle. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to go to the very last question, and we're going to work backwards to getting to our reading or our vocabulary and context questions that we've already done in the first 4. So this is just a strategy that we're going to employ, and a strategy that you can potentially use on your own practice and official SAT reading and writing modules as well. So this question task is asking how to use relevant information from the notes on the left to do a specific thing. In this case, make a generalization about the kind of study conducted by these three people. Read the task first. Then you can go into the notes on the left-hand side and then focus on just which ones make a generalization about the kind of study conducted by Glickman, Brown, and Song. So, reading on the left, we don't really need to read that opening statement that just says researching a topic a student is taking the following notes. We can go straight to the bullets, which are going to be where we have to end up with the generalization we're trying to find in our correct answer. So the first bullet reads, British musicians John Lennon and Paul McCartney shared writing credit for numerous Beatles songs. Not about the generalization of the study, so we're not going to highlight that. Many Lennon-McCartney songs were actually written by either Lennon or McCartney, but not both. Again, this is about just background, not the study and how it was conducted. Next bullet, the exact authorship of specific parts of many Beatles songs, such as the verse for In My Life, is disputed. Again, this is just background. But now in bullet 4, Mark Glickman, Jason Brown, and Ryan Song use statistical methods to analyze the musical content of Beatles songs. We definitely want to highlight that because that is the kind of study that was used. Then in the final bullet, we've got they concluded that there is an 18.9% probability that McCartney wrote the verse for In My Life, stating that the verse is consistent with Lennon's songwriting style. That's the results of the study, not about how the study was conducted. So we need to find an answer choice that really pulls out just this one bullet that we highlighted. So starting with choice A, based on statistical analysis, Glickman, Brown, and Song claim that John Lennon wrote the verse of In My Life. That's just the results, not focusing on the generalization about the kind of study as required by the task, so we can eliminate choice A. Next, choice B, there is only an 18.9% probability that Paul McCartney wrote the verse for In My Life. John Lennon is the more likely author. Again, that's the results, not a generalization about the kind of study. Choice C, it is likely that John Lennon, not Paul McCartney, wrote the verse for In My Life. Again, that is the results, not a generalization about the study. Choice D, researchers have used statistical methods to address questions of authorship within the field of music. Ding, ding, ding. It's very bland, but that's what the question is asking for, and you have to make sure you're addressing the task, not just grabbing the most, we'll say, interesting information, maybe to yourself, maybe you're a Beatles fan. But then we'll just click back through the rest of this because we're at the end of the module, and we're just going to work through in reverse for that strategic time management piece that we talked about a little while ago. Same style question for a handful of these at the very end is what you're going to see at the end of every reading and writing module. So once again, we need to focus on what the student wants to highlight, and we're going to emphasize the study's methodology. So we're going to read these bullets on the left, again, ignoring the introduction, focusing on highlighting whatever the methodology is. First bullet reads, when medical students mention their patients on social media, they may violate patient confidentiality. Terry Kind led a study to determine how many medical schools have student policies that mention social media use. Both of these are just kind of the background here. Then the third bullet, Kind and her team reviewed 132 medical school websites examining publicly available student policies. Well, that is the methodology that we want to highlight. And then the final bullet, only 13 medical schools had guidelines that explicitly mention social media, and only 5 defined what constitutes acceptable social media use. That's just the results, not the methodology. So we need an answer choice that really focuses on the third bullet that we highlighted. Choice A reads, the student policies of 132 medical schools can be found online according to the research by Terry Kind. Well, this actually is just a misinterpretation of the information. It says they reviewed 132 medical school websites, not that there's only 132 online. So A is actually just not true even, and it's certainly not about the methodology anyway. Then choice B, to find out how many medical schools have guidelines about student social media use, Terry Kind and her team examined the student policies of 132 medical schools. Ding, ding, ding. That is exactly what we would have expected. And when you're trying to go through this efficiently, you are going to go very briskly through C and D at this point. Choice C, out of 132 medical schools, only 13 had student policies that mentioned student social media, and only 5 specified what use was acceptable. Those are the results, not the methodology. And then Terry Kind and her team wanted to know how many medical schools have student social media policies in place about protecting patient confidentiality. Well, that is the goal of the study, not the methodology. So the correct answer is B, and we hit back again. Reading from the top, we've got the same style of question. The student wants to explain an advantage of microprobes. So we're going to be focused on highlighting an advantage of microprobes in any of the bullets on the left. First bullet reads, NASA uses rovers, large remote vehicles with wheels, to explore the surface of Mars. NASA's rovers can't explore regions inaccessible to wheeled vehicles. Rovers are also heavy, making them difficult to land on the planet's surface. Microprobes. Oh, finally we've got the microprobe, so this is going to be relevant. We'll highlight it as we read. Robotic probes that weigh as little as 50 milligrams could be deployed virtually anywhere on the surface of Mars. That's the advantage. And the final bullet is about a proposal. It doesn't actually explain the advantages, so we won't highlight that final bullet. So we're going to focus on that fourth bullet, trying to find an answer choice that summarizes its statements. Choice A reads, despite being heavy, NASA's rovers can land successfully on the surface of Mars. That's not about microprobes. Choice B, microprobes, which weigh as little as 50 milligrams, could explore areas of Mars that are inaccessible to NASA's heavy-wheeled rovers. Ding, ding, ding. That is exactly what we would expect. Then choice C, NASA currently uses its rovers on Mars, but microprobes have been proposed as an alternative. That's the proposal, not the advantages, so we can eliminate C as not specifically addressing the task. Then choice D, though they are different sizes, both microprobes and rovers can be used to explore the surface of Mars. Well, again, that doesn't highlight the advantage of microprobes. B does. It's our correct answer. We hit back one more time for the last of our little finding which answer choice is the best synthesis of notes provided style question. Here we read, the student wants to explain how pineapple extract increased the growth rate of P. javanicus. So we have to make sure that we're accomplishing this task of explaining how pineapple extract increases the growth rate of whatever P. javanicus is before we go into the notes. So we're going to focus on that aspect. We learned from the first bullet that P. javanicus is a species of commercially raised fish. Wonderful. Has nothing to do with this pineapple extract thing. Researchers in Indonesia recently found that adding pineapple extract to fish food increased both the feed utilization efficiency and the growth rate of P. javanicus. Again, that tells us what happened, not how the extract increased the growth rate. So we're not going to highlight that bullet. We then learn adding the pineapple extract did not affect total food consumption. So I at least here am talking about the pineapple extract and what it didn't do. This could be relevant. We'll highlight it. Then the next bullet, the researchers thus determined that the increased growth rate resulted from the increased feed utilization efficiency. And so that again is related to what did happen with the pineapple extract. And then most importantly, in the final bullets, we've got the enzyme bromelain in pineapple extract enhances the hydrolysis of ingested proteins. We can change the color if we want to emphasize that a little bit more. And that tells us that the final bullet says this allows the fish to more readily absorb them. And the two pink highlights are certainly the most important ones. And you can kind of adjust on the fly as you're using the interface. Forcing engagement is hugely important. Make sure that you're thinking about doing these things to ensure that you are really paying attention, because that's half of what's happening with maximizing your success on the reading and writing section. So we go to the answer choices looking for something that probably highlights most the two pink bullets at the end, but might address the two yellow bullets in the middle. Choice A, researchers in Indonesia recently found that adding pineapple extract to fish food increased the growth rate of P. javanicus. That's what happened. It doesn't explain how it happened. So we eliminate A as not accomplishing the task. Choice B, an enzyme in pineapple extract, bromelain, increased the growth rate of P. javanicus by enhancing the hydrolysis of ingested proteins. That's correct. But then it says, in turn, affecting the fish's total food consumption. And this part right here is going to go in direct contrast to this third bullet here, because it didn't affect total food consumption. So B is ultimately one of the hardest answer choices to eliminate. It's half right but half wrong, and you can highlight the reason you're eliminating to ensure that you know why you're getting rid of a choice as part of your process. Then choice C, according to the researchers, the growth rate of P. javanicus was affected not by food consumption, but by feed utilization efficiency. Again, this might be true, but it's not telling us how the pineapple extract increase the growth rate of P. javanicus. Then choice D, the enzyme bromelain enhanced P. javanicus's absorption of ingested proteins, which matches this pink part here, increasing the growth rate of fish-fed pineapple extract, brings in the pineapple extract, and D is our correct answer. And we can move back into our first of the transition evaluation question tasks of this exam. So when you're dealing with transition tracking, what you can do is open up your notes and just consider whether you've got you're going to need an agreement or contrast transition. So if it helps, you could break out the parts of the information, or you could just kind of consider them as you're reading and say whether we need something that's going to agree or contrast. So reading from the top, the prime meridian, the global indicator of 0 degrees longitude established in 1884, was originally determined using astronomically derived coordinates. Okay, so that's just what happened with the prime meridian. Blank, as decades passed, new calculations would reveal increasingly precise coordinates, yet the prime meridian remained unchanged. Okay, so we need an agreement transition here. And then at the end, we've got it wasn't until the 1980s that, spurred by improved geodetic data, the prime meridian was officially moved roughly 100 meters east. But that's not what's happening for this transition in the blank. We need agreement from the first sentence to the opening of the second sentence. So looking at choice A specifically, it's not a specific instance as decades past, because decades past aren't specifically part of 1884. So while choice A is kind of agreement, it's not the right type of agreement if we consider the narrative more specifically, oddly enough. Same thing with choice B. To that end, it's not a causation structure. Again and again definitely does match, because we know that it remained unchanged as decades passed. So as decades passed, it just keeps on going. Choice C, not great narrative usage from my perspective, thinking about my journalism degree that I got somewhere in this room. But it certainly matches the narrative for the purposes of this little excerpt. And then granted means that the decades past kind of precede 1884, which again doesn't narratively make any sense. We would want to read this back into the sentence like we did with the vocabulary and context questions on the exam. So we'll do that here just once to illustrate how we can ensure that the narrative is coherent throughout. The prime meridian, the global indicator of 0 degrees longitude established in 1884, was originally determined using astronomically derived coordinates. Again and again, as decades passed, new calculations would reveal increasingly precise coordinates, yet the prime meridian remained unchanged. It wasn't until the 1980s that, spurred by improved geodetic data, the prime meridian was officially moved roughly 100 meters east, and that should be an overall coherent narrative as you consider it. And C, of course, is our correct answer, and we'll hit back to see another of this type of question. So again, we'll just highlight the word after the blank and consider whether we need contrast or agreement. When you have names like we have at the beginning of this sentence, you might just kind of skip over them. I mean, we don't want to waste time pronouncing them. So we're just going to say, researchers report that while mathematicians have traditionally worked alone, evidence points to a shift in the opposite direction. Okay, so we've got this while, and it's going to go in the opposite direction. Again, you can see I'm just highlighting this for clear reference. And then we find that mathematicians are choosing to collaborate with their peers, a trend illustrated by a rise in the number of mathematics publications credited to multiple authors. So again, we've got the shift already mentioned before the blank, and mathematicians are choosing to collaborate as part of that shift. So we've got another agreement transition that needs to come here. Now, similarly is not going to be the correct answer choice, because even though it's agreement, it's not literally like a similar situation. So we can eliminate choice A for that reason. For this reason, no, it's not the shift that's causing the mathematicians to make the shift. So B just narratively doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, again, it's an example. It's not a conclusive chronological kind of relationship here. So we can eliminate choice C, even though it might indicate agreement. Increasingly certainly builds on the trend. So we would read this back into the paragraph to confirm that it makes overall coherent narrative sense. But for the purposes of this video, we will just hit back at this point, seeing another one of these types of questions. And we're going to just highlight sure Gil so that we can track agreement, or contrast. And if we're having any trouble, we can just actually call out part one and summarize it for ourselves, and we'll then consider whether we are going to have a transition that should be agreement or contrast, and we'll do that by then thinking about part two. So we'll read from the top. In November 1934, we'll just call her ASG, was living in what must have seemed like the ideal city for a young artist, Paris. She was studying firsthand the color-saturated style of France's modernist paint masters and beginning to make a name for herself as a painter. So part one is just ASG doing well in Paris. So we've got that. We're going to skip over the transition. We're going to read what comes after the blank. So then, SG longed to return to her childhood home of India. Only there, she believed, could her art truly flourish. Well, now we go, ASG wants to return to India. Well, if she's doing well in Paris but wants to return to India, we need a contrast transition here. So this is how you could break these out a little bit more if you need to on the exam. So now we're looking for contrast indicators. Still might be a contrast transition, therefore certainly is not, indeed certainly is not, and furthermore certainly is not. And if we were to read still back into this little narrative, it should create an overall coherent story for the paragraph. For the purposes of this video, we'll just hit back though and get into now our grammatical questions. So once more, we have a little blank and we've got very simple verb changes. So when this happens, you can actually, in most cases, ignore any sentences that aren't pertaining to this blank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just open up those notes again, and we see that we've got verb tenses, so I just need to find the subject for whatever verb is going to come here. So we'll read from just the top of this second sentence because we don't really care about the opening sentence. The 20th century Kashmiri American poet ASA, again, we're just going to make it initials so that we're not struggling to pronounce if we're not familiar with how to do it, explains that each one of the ghazal's couplets, while adhering to the patterns of rhyme and refrain established in the poem's opening lines, blank, thematically, and logically autonomous, resulting in a poem with a stringently formal disunity. You can kind of skip over the parentheticals that do not affect the subject-verb relationship. Similarly, this entire descriptive clause in the middle of these two commas is going to just describe what our subject is, and we can kind of ignore that too. So what becomes thematically and logically autonomous is going to be each one of a ghazal's couplets. So we'll highlight that, and we now know that our subject is going to be literally each, and each is going to be singular. So we know that our correct answer has to be singular for the verb. Is certainly is singular. Were would not be, have been would not be, are would not be, and we've got our correct answer, and you can see how you can really just kind of focus on subject specifically to make that kind of question go pretty quickly in the end, and potentially use the notes again to enforce engagement up front. So then here we can see we clearly have changes in punctuation. So once again, we're going to just highlight the blank here, and we're going to bring in our notes, and we're going to use something known as the vertical line test. So we're going to just put a vertical line in between the two words where our first piece of punctuation comes up in the answer choices. So we can see that there's some sort of punctuation between conservation and though in each of these choices. So we need to consider whether the punctuation needed is going to be in between two complete ideas, a complete and incomplete idea, or two incomplete ideas, where there'd be no need for punctuation. And a complete idea should be able to stand alone as its own independent sentence if it didn't have everything coming before or after it. So we're going to just read up to conservation and consider whether there is a subject and verb that would allow that clause or phrase to stand on its own as a complete idea or not. So economists have observed that improvements in efficiency economists have observed that improvements in efficiency often correlate negatively with resource conservation. Okay, economists have observed is a subject verb, and we know what they observed, so this is a complete idea, and you can see that, again, I didn't really care about that opening sentence. It's not going to affect the punctuation in the subsequent sentence, so we just read from economists. Then we're going to pick up with though and consider the same concept. So, though efficiency gains, lowering the cost of use, may increase demand to the extent that resource consumption ultimately rises. Well, efficiency gains are the subject for everything after the though and after the vertical line, and those efficiency gains may increase. So, we've got another complete idea. And we need to have what is often considered stop punctuation between two complete ideas. That's going to be a semicolon or a period, most usually. So we can eliminate any of the answer choices that do not have a semicolon. Now we need to consider the transition of though, whether the though is going to transit or is going to contrast with what came before this sentence that starts with economists, or whether we want the contrast to come afterwards. And we should be already thinking, well, these two statements in this sentence are going to be in agreement. So the though needs to contrast with what came before. And at this point only am I really going to read that opening sentence. So with the development of new technology that use natural resources more efficiently, the overall consumption of those resources might be expected to decrease. Economists have observed that improvements in efficiency often correlate negatively with resource conservation, though. So that though needs to be before the semicolon so that it makes the contrast come before the mention of efficiency gains. And our correct answer here is going to be C. Moving backward to number 18 here, we have pretty much the same concept. So we're going to just open this up. We're going to put our little vertical line. And again, we can just jump right into reading from they. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity. So if I just think about that, we've got they were not. That's a subject verb pair. So this is a complete idea. Then after the vertical line, we pick up with however. However, some of the most prominent figures of the earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. Well, from the however, we also have a subject and a verb. The sum of the most prominent figures were also influenced. So we've got two complete ideas. We need a semicolon again. So that allows us to eliminate choices A and B. Once more, we need to consider whether that however is supposed to contrast within this single sentence with the semicolon or against the stuff at the in the first sentence. We would probably read that sentence again in full. This is so very similar to the previous one, though. For the purposes of this video, we're just going to say, you know what, that however has to contrast against what came before, because these people were not the first in England, even though it seemed like they might have. And so our correct answer is C, and we hit back one more time. Here we've got a slightly subtle and kind of tricky little problem. So we've got a bunch of different descriptive phrases, and we once again are not going to consider this introductory sentence. We're going to just pick up with known as the brass era. The brass era. This period in automotive design is remembered for its grandeur and artistry. So I'm going to just highlight this because that's our main clause. And we know it because we've got this period is remembered. We've got a subject and a verb, and we've got a comma after it. So that means that whatever comes after that comma cannot be its own independent clause. We'd create a run-on. And you have to recognize that the non-underlined anything else in the sentence or sentences presented for these grammar questions has to be correct. So I don't want to create another independent clause. And if I said its vehicles are highly prized by collectors, that could stand alone as its own independent clause. So A is out. Same thing with B, had been highly prized. Same thing with D, had been or were highly prized. Only choice C creates a descriptive clause that goes back to the main clause in pink here and is our correct answer for number 17. And we move back here to consider a relatively straightforward one, ultimately. Again, we don't really care about the introductory sentence, so we just have, in a pivotal 2007 article, plant cell biologist Yuri Lee. Okay, so if we put a comma between biologist and Yuri Lee, it makes it sound like there are two different people. It's really just one. If we have a comma between Yuri Lee and showed, we create what is known as a comma splice, and that we don't want to separate the subject Yuri Lee from its verb showed in that fashion. Biologist Yuri Lee, no punctuation, showed, that makes sense. And again, if choice D were correct, then we'd have a biologist and Yuri Lee separated, and we don't want that. It is Yuri Lee who is the biologist, which is why the correct answer here would be C. And then we've got one more narrative conventions of standard English question. once more, we're going to try to ignore that opening statement. We can see we've got changes in the verb tenses, so we're going to really have to read this in full and then think about what might be the correct verb tense proactively. So we learned his energetic gestures announcing when a player had struck out and his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of blank transform the traditionally solemn umpire role into a dynamic one. Well, this word transform, oops, one there, transform, is the verb for his energetic gestures. So if we have a comma between those gestures and helping, we create, again, we basically mistake the subject verb pair, so B is going to be out. Now, if we say that helped transform, well, now we're going to create a fragment. And again, bounds to help transform creates another fragment because it just makes it a descriptor, not an actual predicate. Whereas here, if we have bounds helped, we can read it back in and we'll have a correct subject predicate pair. His energetic gestures announcing when a player had struck out and his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of bounds help transform the traditionally solemn umpire role into a dynamic one, creates a complete sentence, and that's why A is our correct answer. And now when we hit back, we are into our reading questions, and we should be able to have a little bit more time now to work through these last 10 questions, knowing that we've done everything in the English part or the writing part of this section. So we're just being asked to logically complete the text. So I actually want to go to the end of the text and figure out what we're trying to do first. So it says, given that Polynesia was peopled only in the last 3,000 years, the team concluded something. So we're going to just highlight that and we're going to focus. Oops, and sometimes that'll happen. If you don't see the highlight little tool come up like this, that's going to indicate that it didn't necessarily register. And I can also open up those notes again to take notes on what the details are. So the domestic sweet potato descends from a wild plant native to South America. It also populates the Polynesian islands, where evidence confirms that native Hawaiians and other indigenous people were cultivating the plant centuries before seafaring first occurred over the thousands of miles of ocean separating them from South America. So we know that the SP in Polynesia is earlier than sailing. So it wasn't able to come across from South America, basically. So to explain how the sweet potato was first introduced in Polynesia, botanist Pablo Munoz Rodriguez and colleagues analyzed the DNA of numerous varieties of the plant, concluding that the Polynesian varieties diverged from South American ones over 100,000 years ago. So we know that the SP in Polynesia separated from the SP in SA 100K years ago. Well, 100K plus years ago. Force the engagement. Because now we know, if we look at the final statement, that since Polynesia only got people in the last 3,000 years, that potato had to come before the people. So starting with choice A, the cultivation of the sweet potato in Polynesia likely predates its cultivation in South America. That's actually backwards. We know that it did separate from the South American potato, so that's out. Choice B, Polynesian peoples likely acquired the sweet potato from South American peoples only within the last 3,000 years. Again, that's a reversal of the information. Human activity likely played no role in the introduction of the sweet potato in Polynesia. Ding, ding, ding. Exactly what we should recognize from our notes. And then choice D, Polynesian sweet potato varieties likely descend from a single South American variety that was domesticated, not wild. Definitely not, and we don't know that for certain, so we'll click back at this point. Got another most logically completes the text task, so we're going to go to the end first, and here it reads the unmodified plants exhibited accelerated flowering while the altered ones did not, which is going to apparently suggest something. So we've got to focus on unmodified versus modified plants and flowering. So a team of biologists, again, skip over the names, investigated the mechanism that allows AT plants to accelerate flowering at high temperatures. They replace the protein ELF3 in the plants with a similar protein found in another species that, unlike AT, displays no acceleration in flowering with increased temperature. A comparison of unmodified AT plants with the altered plants showed no difference in flowering at 22 degrees, but at 27 degrees Celsius than those unmodified plants exhibited accelerated flowering. So that means that the ELF3 was necessary to accelerate the flowering, and we should have that as a mental prediction as we go to the answer choices. We don't know that temperature sensitive accelerating flowering is unique to AT. We're just talking about AT. There might be other plants that do this. Choice B, AT increases ELF3 production as temperatures rise. It's not about ELF3 production. They basically are kind of affecting the ELF3 as part of the experiment, so we can eliminate B for that reason. Choice C, ELF3 enables AT to respond to increased temperatures. Ding, ding, ding. Exactly the relationship that we might have recognized in our upfront read. And then choice D, temperatures of at least 22 degrees Celsius are required for AT to flower. Well, actually, it kind of flowers at 27 degrees, so this is a little bit of an information reversal anyway. So choice C is our correct answer, and we hit back one more time. Here, we are being asked to use data from the table to complete a statement. So we're looking at this. If we see this, we got to go back and figure out what this was. Now we got this transition. So we've got this transition, which is going to be the whole thing. So the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector has declined in both France and the United States, while employment in the service sector has risen. So that will highlight in pink. But we learned this transition has happened at different rates in the two countries. We can highlight that in yellow, and we need to find how that is proven by the information in the chart. And we basically can see that by the year 1950 in the US, agriculture and manufacturing have gone and flipped. Well, actually, agriculture and services, rather, have flipped pretty heavily, whereas that change doesn't really happen in France until 2012. So we just need to find an answer choice that reflects this. So using the employment sector by both countries in 1900 versus 1950, well, that's the exact point where we've got the disparity between France and the US, so that would match. B, 1800 with 2012 is the whole thing. That's not going to match. 1900 with 2012, they've all caught up by that point. And 1800 with 1900, they're still the same. So our correct answer is A, and we hit back once more. Now we're looking to support the researcher's hypothesis. So we'll just highlight that as the task. We go straight to the hypothesis, which is that the researchers hypothesize that the plants depend on dissolving underlying rock with these acids. And we're going to just open up our little note again, and we can see that we've got in the mountains of Brazil, two plants established themselves on soilless, nutrient-poor patches of quartzite rock. These ecologists use microscopic analysis to determine that the roots grow directly into quartzite, have clusters of fine hair near the root tip, and these hairs secrete these kinds of acids. And the acids are apparently dissolving the rock to create channels for continued growth and release phosphates that provide these nutrients. So our prediction is just find info to show that the acid use is not accidental. Like these plants are intentionally doing this. So choice A, other species in the family are found in terrains with more soil but have roots similar. Well, actually, this is a reversal. It makes it seem like it's done for some other thing because it happens elsewhere where there aren't these rocks. Then choice B, these two plants both secrete these acids. Each produces the acids in different proportions. Well, different proportions, what does that mean? I have no idea. Need additional information. Can eliminate choice B for that reason. Then choice C, the roots of these plants carve new entry points into rocks even when cracks in the surface are readily available. Well, hey, this shows that it happens all the time. So C supports the conclusion. And then choice D, they thrive when transferred to the surfaces of rocks that do not contain phosphates. Well, again, that's going to require additional information, whereas C directly supported the conclusion, and we hit back one more time. So once more, we're looking to support some sort of researcher hypothesis, and the hypothesis is that Arctic squirrels are going to exhibit longer bouts of torpor and shorter episodes of arousal than Alaskan marmots, so we're going to just be focused on this part of the chart and this part of the chart, and we got to find an answer choice that matches it. So the Alaska marmot arousal episode lasts for days. It does not. It's 21.2 hours. As soon as something's wrong, you can eliminate it. So goodbye, A. The Alaska marmots and Alaska ground squirrels both maintain torpor for several consecutive days. Well, this isn't a distinction between the two, so we can eliminate B because that's a similarity. We want to show that one is different from the other. Choice C, the Alaska marmots had shorter torpor bouts, so that's going to be the shorter torpor bouts, so that's going to be 13.18 days, 81 days versus 16, yes. Longer arousal episodes, yes, and so that matches exactly what the hypothesis was. And lastly, choice D, pardon me, the Alaska marmots had more torpor bouts than arousal episodes, but their arousal episodes were much shorter than the torpor bouts. Has nothing to do with the squirrels, so our correct answer is C, and we hit back one more time. Here we're looking for a quotation to illustrate whatever the claim is on the left-hand side. So we need to figure out the claim first, which is simply that in the poem, Whitman suggests that he deeply understands the reader whom he addresses directly. So that's us. So we need to find which of these answer choices is going to say, yeah, Whitman knows us. So choice A, your true soul and body appear before me. Well, it sounds like you know me then. So choice A seems pretty good. Choice B, whoever you are now, I place my hand whoever you are now, I place my hand upon you that you be my poem. Doesn't say that he knows us. Again, you're going to see this little bullet or this little pop-up when it's 5 minutes. Don't overreact. You're going to have enough time. Continue your processes. Choice C, I should have made my way straight to you long ago. Doesn't show that Whitman knows us. Whoever you are, I fear you are walking the walks of dreams. Again, does not show that Whitman knows us. Choice A certainly does. We hit back. And here we've got which choice best states the main idea of the text. When you're dealing with main idea, you can highlight pieces that are more important than others. So we'll read this paragraph in full. 18th century economist Adam Smith is famed for his metaphor of the invisible hand, which he putatively used to illustrate a robust model of how individuals produce aggregate benefits by pursuing their own economic interests. Note putatively. As Gavin Kennedy has shown, Smith deploys this metaphor only once in his economic writings to make a narrow point about the then dominant economic theory of mercantilism, and it was largely ignored until some 20th century economists eager to secure an intellectual pedigree for their views elevated it to a fully fledged paradigm. So we know that Adam Smith is famed for the invisible hand, but he doesn't really use it, actually. It's only come into knowledge because some 20th century economists wanted to use it to elevate their own views. So we've got that as our prediction. We're looking for reasons to eliminate as we go through the answer choices. So although Smith is famed for his metaphor of the invisible hand, the metaphor was largely ignored. Okay, until economists in the 20th century came to realize that the metaphor was a robust model that it didn't anticipate their own views. They basically validated their views. So A is incorrect for the end. Always read the choices to the end. Choice B, some 20th century economists gave Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand a significance it does not have in Smith's work, but it is nevertheless a useful model. No, we're not talking about how it's useful. Choice C, Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand has been interpreted as a model of how individuals acting in their own interest produce aggregate benefits, but there's nothing about the economists that we mentioned at the end from the 20th century, so choice C is out. And then choice D, the reputation of Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand is not due to the importance of the metaphor in Smith's work, true, but rather to the promotion of the metaphor by some later economists for their own ends. Absolutely, it's correct in both aspects, and we hit back. Now, for number 7, we're being asked for the function of the underlined sentence. So this is asking, why is it there, not just what does it say? So we can potentially just highlight here and get our notes. So we're going to have a mental prediction in the notes of why that sentence is there. It reads, several studies have found negligible electoral consequences for governments that impose fiscal austerity measures, yet some European governments recently suffered electorally due to their austerity programs. These researchers attribute this incongruity to governments' tendency, not followed in the recent European cases, to implement austerity programs strategically to avoid electoral costs, which has obscured the inherent political risk of austerity measures in the election data scholars have examined. So it's basically to introduce a kind of contradiction that is then explained. So we can be pretty bland. Now, explains a discrepancy between what has been observed in study settings and what has been observed in real-world settings, and the text goes on to assert that is attributable to the studies not using real-world data. They did use real-world data, so that's out. Choice B, it identifies a conflict between research findings and recent events that the text goes on is a consequence to suggest as a consequence of a complicating factor in the data used to generate those findings. Absolutely. Presents a long-standing divergence. I don't know what's long-standing. And then it describes a recent exception to a general pattern in research findings that the text goes on to explain as a result of researchers underestimating significance of inconsistencies. Absolutely, there's not inconsistencies. It's just about when they got their data. We hit back, and we've got the function of the underlined sentence once again. So why is this sentence here? Lily had no real intimacy with nature, but she had a passion for the appropriate and could be keenly sensitive to a scene which was the fitting background of her own sensations. The landscape outspread below her seemed an enlargement of her present mood, and she she found something of herself in its calmness, its breadth, its long free reaches. On the nearer slopes of the sugar maples wavered like pyres of light. Lower down was a massing of gray orchards, and here and there the lingering green of an oak grove. Mentally, we can predict that this is basically just to expand on the idea that she was keenly sensitive to nature. So it's not about detailing the image of the physical scene. It is not about an internal conflict. It's not an assertion that is expanded on in the next sentence. It is an idea that is introduced in the previous sentence. And our prior question here, we're being asked about the overall structure of the text. And we can see that we've got this letter to Charlotte, and then it is being read by Charlotte, who gets excited about it. That's going to match choice A. Make sure you select something before the timer goes out, because whatever you have selected is going to be chosen as your answer. And this module is over. You will then be introduced to this slide that is going to show you your break time. The break is going to be always there between the second reading and writing module before the first static math module. And hopefully you've found this video of explanations for Module 2's hardest section that you can see on Bluebook exam number 10 helpful as you continue your own SAT journey to your test day, whenever it might be.